Welcome to the hidden history of slavery in New York. I'm Richard French. Across the country right now, a debate is raging about what should and shouldn't be taught about slavery in schools. Some states want it practically wiped from the curriculum, while others teach an incomplete history at best. I wanted to learn more after my family and I went on a tour of slavery sites in New York. It was shocking and eye-opening, and I read in the 1619 Project about the city's role in the slave trade. Over the next half hour, I'm going to show you the untold history of slavery, much of it not in my history books, and explain how it wasn't just in the South. It was right here in New York. When you think about slavery, what probably comes to mind are plantations in Mississippi, slave ships docking in New Orleans, or slave markets in South Carolina. But something I never fully learned in school is the fact that New York City also had those things, plus a robust economy that benefited from the slave trade and enslaved labor. We're going to dig deeply into that story and also discuss the importance of having an honest national conversation about that painful history. For that, we'll speak with one of the country's most prominent voices on the subject, Bryan Stevenson, the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and also the author of the best-selling book Just Mercy, which I read in high school. It was turned into an award-winning film starring Michael B. Jordan portraying Stevenson. We'll also show you how enslaved people lived and died in New York. And another thing I was surprised to learn, that the slaves helped build the city into what it is today. Then we will pay a visit to Albany, where I learned that New York was behind the curve in freeing its slaves, with lawmakers and judges protecting and extending slavery instead of leading the charges to outlaw the brutal institution. But let's start in New Netherland, the city that became New York. The entire economy in the Deep South revolved around slavery. But I also discovered when I started doing some digging that the full extent and brutality of slavery in New York has been largely glossed over. It was deeply connected with every aspect of the economy in New York.
The commodity stock market was all based on enslaved produced goods. So New York had a huge economic interest in slavery.
In fact, places that thousands of New Yorkers and tourists pass every day were built on the backs of slave labor, and there isn't even a plaque or a marker to recognize their sacrifices.
These are the people who built Broadway. They built the wall. From Albany to Argentina, this is the story of how African labor helped to shape the Americas.
The conditions the enslaved endured in New York were as bad as any that slaves that picked cotton in Mississippi lived with and died from. I went on a tour of slavery sites in the city, and you had to search long and hard to find out what had happened. One of those sites is the African Burial Ground, on a quiet street near Foley Square that thousands of people pass every day without a clue about what they are walking over. It was discovered in 1991 when the federal government started building a 34-story office tower. But workers had to halt construction when they started to unearth human remains. What they found was astounding and of incredible historical significance. The African Burial Ground was a 6-acre site that contained the skeletal remains of at least 15,000 Africans buried between 1630 and 1795. And those remains tell a brutal story.
The average age of burial is 22 years old, with 40% being children, meaning early aging, early death, disease, overwork is evidenced in the bones.
Slaves lived and died in the city. They were also bought and sold there. The slave market on Wall Street operated for more than half of the 18th century, and it was one of the largest on the continent. But you never know it, because only a tiny plaque marks the site. Another painful chapter in New York's history that hasn't made it into the history books. The harbor was an essential part of the transatlantic slave trade that trafficked millions of Africans into lives of bondage in the Americas. Dozens of slave ships docked in the harbor, then unloaded their human cargo. And dozens of slaves were hanged and even burned alive right in Lower Manhattan during revolts in 1712 and 1741. Many historians say the enslaved Africans were framed, But that didn't stop the local government from hanging 18 of them and burning 13 of them alive. We always learned that New York grew as Europeans came here to trade and make money. But we never learned that as the population of the city soared, the slave population grew right along with it. By the middle of the 18th century, 20% of the city's population was enslaved, and nearly half of the people who lived there owned other people. Only Charleston, South Carolina, had a larger percentage of slave owners. An economy fueled by slavery helped build New York into what it is today, the financial capital of the world. By some estimates, New York received 40% of the entire country's cotton revenue through the banks, shipping companies, and insurance companies that raked in big bucks on the backs of slaves. And many major companies that either call New York home or have large footprints in the city had deep ties to slavery. That includes firms that became J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America, and insurance companies like New York Life and Aetna that profited by insuring enslaved people. You'd never know it by walking around, but even today, many streets, neighborhoods, and entire islands like Rikers Island are named after people who owned other people, got rich off of selling other people, or were part of the system that kept slavery thriving for centuries in New York. Peter Stuyvesant was the most famous and last Dutch governor of New Netherland. He was also instrumental in expanding the slave trade, making New York a key point of entry. Right now, a massive housing complex on the east side, a park, a high school, and an entire neighborhood of Brooklyn still bear his name. And several streets in the city are still named after slave traders and people who owned other people, including Delancey Street, both Duane and Reed Street, Beekman Street, Bleecker Street, and too many others to mention. New York has always been portrayed as a progressive place. But when it comes to the most painful chapter in our country's history, it was anything but. The state government aided and abetted slavery, making sure it stayed legal well after neighboring states started freeing their slaves. We're telling this story because it's important to shine some light on a chapter in our history that people don't want to talk about, but everyone should know about. At the end of this program, you'll see why the story of slavery in New York is really the story of the city itself and how it has grown into what it is today. We start here, in Montgomery, Alabama, the home of two important sites that tell the story of how African American people have been treated in this country. I'm talking about the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the first memorial dedicated to the history of enslaved black people and people terrorized by lynchings. Montgomery is also home to the Equal Justice Initiative, a human rights organization that's founded and run by Bryan Stevenson. He's also the man who led the creation of both places. The EJI recently released a comprehensive report on the transatlantic slave trade that was both eye-opening and extremely disturbing. You probably recognize Stevenson from, among other things, his best-selling book, Just Mercy, which told his story as an attorney combating the often unfair criminal justice system. The story culminates in his successful legal efforts that led to the exoneration of a wrongly convicted man. The book was turned into a major motion picture where he was portrayed by Michael B. Jordan. Stevenson's work at the EJI was also the subject of an Emmy Award-winning HBO documentary called True Justice. I'm joined by Mr. Stevenson now at the annex of the Legacy Museum. Mr. Stevenson, thank you so much for joining us today. The EJI just did a major report on the transatlantic slave trade. They deemed it one of the most horrific eras in world history. Won't people be shocked to find out New York City played such a huge role?
I think that the history of the United States and the northeastern United States in this horrific era of the transatlantic slave trade is not well understood. Most people, when they think about slavery in America, they think about the American South. And there's reasons for that. By the end of the Civil War, 90% of the enslaved population lived in the Deep South. But that was largely a 19th century phenomenon. That started in the 1800s. What happened in the 1600s and the 1700s is largely a story about the Northeast. It was in New Amsterdam, which became New York City, in the early 1600s, that 11 enslaved people were brought to that city that began New York City's relationship to enslavement. Over the course of the next century and a half, thousands of enslaved people were trafficked to the ports of New York City. New York was the primary slave trading space in America throughout most of the 17th century and the early 18th century. And you cannot understand New York and its economic growth and development without understanding the role of slavery. And we do call the period of the transatlantic slave trade as one of the worst eras of American history because nothing disrupted the population of people on this planet more than the trafficking of 12 million enslaved people from their homes in Africa where they were abducted, kidnapped, and brought across the Atlantic Ocean in this terrifying journey. 2 million died during the passing of the Atlantic Ocean. Their bodies lay at the bottom of the ocean. And we've done very little to reckon with that. And so, yes, the economic and political development of New York was entwined with enslavement. And even after there was less active trading in New York City, New York created laws to make slavery a permanent hereditary status. So the children of enslaved Black people in New York City were born not free, but enslaved. The history of slavery in New York is quite pronounced, it's quite extensive, and you can't understand the development of New York State or New York City without understanding the impact of slavery.
Slavery built the majority of New York City, and the financial industry itself, quite frankly, wouldn't be a thing if it wasn't for slavery. Can you expand on that?
First of all, there was the literal building of the city, which was achieved through the labor of enslaved people, the clearing of the land. Enslaved people lived in Brooklyn, and they created crops to feed enslavers on the other side of the river. They built the structures that now home Wall Street. It was also the economics of slavery that allowed New York to become a thriving financial center. There were families like the Lehman Brothers in Montgomery developing trading in cotton as a way of creating wealth, and that developed throughout the 19th century, so that by the middle of the 19th century, the United States was exporting cotton all over the world and creating a lot of wealth. New York City was central to that. And so there's a really powerful connection between the New York financial world and the enslavement of Black people in the American South and the exploitation, if you will, of that labor to create lots and lots of wealth for a handful of people in this country.
Most people think New York was leading the way to liberate slaves. But weren't the courts and the legislature not so honorable?
I don't think anyone in New York should feel like they were the shining leader on these issues. After the Civil War, the state of New York elected a governor, Horatio Seymour, who was the prominent and leading white supremacist in this country. He declared that America, after the Civil War, is a white man's country. He supported racial hierarchy. He supported disenfranchising Black people. And he was the leader of the state of New York. He actually ran for president on a campaign of restoring the racial hierarchy that had been well established during the time of slavery. I don't think you see New York quite in the way that some people want to see New York, which is untouched by the legacy of slavery.
I recently visited the mass burial ground in Lower Manhattan, where 15,000 Africans were buried. Nearby, there were public lynchings and people being burned alive. Still, little public attention is paid. New York doesn't really acknowledge its role in slavery, does it?
No, I don't think we've done a good job anywhere in this country, and that includes New York, in acknowledging this history. I don't think anything has been more central to the evolution of the country than our struggle over the institution of slavery. And yet, we haven't created many cultural sites. We haven't created many places to remember. We have a 9/11 memorial in New York, and we built it less than 15 years after that tragic day. I think it's appropriate that there is a 9/11 memorial. But what I think that memorial says is that the things that matter, the things that are important, the things that have caused us pain and caused us anguish, but also caused us triumph, are things that we have to memorialize. And we haven't done that for the institution of slavery. And I think that reflects a real resistance to being honest with this past. I don't think any person being educated in New York should grow up without understanding the history of slavery in that city, without reckoning with the violence and the racial bias that that institution created that extends into the 19th century, the 20th century with the violence that we've described. So we have a lot of work to do to create the kind of environment that shields people from violence and from assault and from wrongful conviction or police attacks because of their color. And we won't be able to achieve that if we don't understand the roots of that, which I think begin with an understanding of this history and the legacy of slavery.
At the memorial here, I noticed the name Robert Lewis. I think a lot of people would be surprised to figure out less than 60 miles from New York City, a little more than 100 years ago, this man was lynched.
The lynching of Robert Lewis in 1892 in Port Jervis is another example of the way in which that same bigotry, which characterized most of the American South, took over a community in New York. A 28-year-old black man was accused of an assault on a young white woman. He wasn't proved to have done that. He wasn't convicted of having done that. And yet a mob tortured him and lynched him. And it just speaks to how that the politics of fear and anger, these emotions that give rise to racial violence, exist in New York just like they exist in other parts of the country. And the Robert Lewis lynching is a powerful example of the way in which that mob violence and these threats manifested themselves in New York and will manifest themselves again if we're not attentive to learning the lessons we need to learn.
Up next, we head from the state capital of Alabama to the state capital of New York to show you how lawmakers up there enshrined and enabled slavery for centuries, keeping people enslaved for decades after neighboring states abolished it. We now continue our look at the hidden history of slavery in New York by leaving Alabama and heading to the Empire State. We'll start in the city, then go to the capital in Albany, where we'll focus on how lawmakers in the courts kept slavery legal in New York, even after neighboring states started freeing their slaves.
Everyone got their economic foundation through slavery in New York. This is why New York was so pro-slavery.
Stacy Toussaint's a local historian and founder of the Inside Out tours. I took that tour and we visited several sites in Manhattan that were key to the slave trade. Most of them not even mentioned in any of my history books. All of that got me interested in learning more about what really happened. We of course learned that New York is the financial capital of the world, but we never learned how instrumental slavery was in making it that way.
The commodities trade, which was one of the first stock markets, the commodity stock market, was all based on enslaved produced goods like cotton, tobacco, sugar, coffee. So New York had a huge economic interest in slavery.
And the actual wall built to protect the settlers, the barrier that gave Wall Street its very name, was built by enslaved people. That tour also took us to the foot of Wall Street, where one of the largest slave markets in the country operated. But now, just a small plaque marks the spot, as people go about their day walking right by, largely oblivious to the horrors that happened there. Dozens of slave ships continuously for decades used the harbor to unload their human cargo, but you'd never know it.
I mean, I think New York has a lot of hidden history, and unfortunately, its history with slavery falls within that category. So we have a long way to go in terms of just reflecting the true history of the city.
But one site that is well documented and well marked is the African burial ground, right near the courthouses in Lower Manhattan. There's a museum explaining the contributions of the enslaved people that also shows how they lived and how they died. Park Ranger Emily Welch explains what was found when the site was first discovered.
An estimated 15,000 free and enslaved individuals, the majority being children under the age of 16.
The remains also showed how miserable the conditions were for those slaves. Malnutrition, broken bones, severe trauma, and early death. While slaves were breaking their backs building the city and helping it thrive, 150 miles up the Hudson River in Albany, lawmakers and judges were preserving and protecting that brutal institution well into the 19th century. Delaware, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and even Virginia took steps to free their slaves in the 1770s, decades before New York's legislature passed a gradual abolition act in 1799. But it was loaded with loopholes that kept people enslaved. We were granted unique access to the original documents at the New York State Archives and Museum. An archivist, Jasmine Bumpers, explained how thousands of people remained in bondage well after 1799.
Up there is a copy of the 1799 Gradual Abolition of Slavery law, where slaves after July 4th, 1799, anyone born after July 4th, 1799 was considered free after a period of servitude, 25 for females, 28 for males.
Then in 1870, lawmakers passed another supposed abolition act, but it still didn't stop people from owning other people.
That basically freed slaves that were born before July 4th, 1799. But all the other same provisions were still there. The servitude period of 25, 28 for females and males was still there. And it also allowed people to bring their slaves up from the South without being punished.
So even decades after the first Abolition Act was passed, slavery still existed in New York. And to make matters worse, the state's second constitution in 1821 made it easier for whites to vote, but it effectively disenfranchised black people.
This is where the property and tax requirement for white male voters was removed. However, black men, they were given the right to vote, but they also maintained that provision where they had to own property, $250 worth.
I also got to see original documents that show how accepted and organized slavery was in New York. PJ Nastasi from the New York State Library showed some of them to us.
So what we have laid out here for you are bills of sale for enslaved people. This one in particular down here is of interest. This is from 1740. It was the sale of an enslaved person to Peter Schuyler. Of course, the Schuylers were a very prominent elite family in the state of New York. Many connections to politicians and other prominent people, including Hamilton, who married into the Schuyler family.
New York has a reputation for being progressive and ahead of the curve on many things, including social issues. But when it came to one of the darkest chapters in our history, slavery, New York has very little to be proud of. Up next, we'll bring back Bryan Stevenson, one of the most prominent voices on civil rights and slavery, and he'll explain why it's so important for us to teach a full history of this country, even the most difficult chapters. Earlier in the show, we spoke with Bryan Stevenson about how prevalent and violent slavery in New York was, how the enslaved helped to build the city into what it is, and how lawmakers and judges in Albany extended and abetted the institution, even while neighboring states were freeing their slaves. As our nation becomes more and more polarized, this issue of slavery and how to address it is making front-page news and causing a lot of controversy. Some states, like California, at one point considered paying reparations to the descendants of slaves, while others, led by Florida and as many as a dozen other red states, don't even want it taught in their classrooms, saying the very subject of slavery is divisive, so better to skip it entirely. In fact, in Florida, a new curriculum was announced that stunningly teaches students that slavery was somehow beneficial to those in chains, stating, quote, "Enslaved people develop skills for personal benefit," end quote. That has led to people taking to the streets to protest in Florida. Let's bring back Bryan Stevenson, the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, to explain why it is so important for us to remember our history, especially the most painful chapters. There's so much we've never learned in school about slavery in New York. At one point, nearly half of New Yorkers owned slaves. How incomplete are school curriculums about slavery?
Oh, I think we have done a really poor job in helping this country understand this history. We just haven't acknowledged the role of slavery. We haven't talked about it. I mean, we're in a very different situation in the United States than other countries that have lived through horrific human rights violations. So in South Africa, there's a lot of focus on the harm done by apartheid. In Germany, you see a lot of effort to reckon with the history of the Holocaust, because again, there was a transfer in power. The Germans lost the war, and so there's been the opportunity to create an honest reckoning with that history. There's never really been a shift in power. The people who enslaved Africans, the people who enslaved Black people born in this country, never really lost power. And so for too long, the strategy has been to deny or to minimize or to not educate people about the role of slavery and the harm of slavery, the trauma of slavery, the brutality of slavery in our educational spaces. I want to talk about these things because I believe that the liberation of our country, that our achieving our great aspirations depend on reckoning with this history. I think there's something that feels more like freedom waiting for us. I think there's something that feels more like equality waiting for us. I feel like there's something that feels more like justice waiting for us, but we can't get there if we don't overcome the barriers that have been created by our history of slavery, by our history of lynching, by the racial narratives that we have inherited, which are rooted in these false ideas that some people are better than other people because of their color. And so I think part of why we need to see prioritizing education about this history is not just so that we're informed, but I think we have to prioritize education about this history because it's the only way we actually get free. It's the only way we get to a place where we can actually be that city shining on a hill, where we can be that country that reflects the best of what democracy can yield. We can't get there if we don't talk honestly about our past and our failings.
Can you tell our audience why it's so important that both the memorial and the museum are located here in Montgomery?
I do think that every American should commit to learning more about this history because none of us were taught things that we should have been taught. I think it becomes important that we take it on as a project, and we want people to journey here to Montgomery and spend time at our Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And I think that journey is important because we can put this history in a broader context. Where we're sitting here in Montgomery is a space that became the most prominent slave trading space in America before the Civil War. Montgomery had one of the largest populations of enslaved people in the country in 1860. And so the history of slavery is here and resonant. Coming to Montgomery for me is an opportunity to begin a journey, to begin a quest, to engage in the kind of pilgrimage that ultimately allows us to know the things we need to know, to hear the things we need to hear, to see the things we need to see, to push for a more just society, to push for a healthier country, to go back to places like New York and insist that we do the work that's required to create the kind of just society that we want to live in.
Last year, the Florida governor signed a bill limiting education of racial history. He said students shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable about the past. This is also happening in many other states. What's your reaction to this?
I don't think we can not learn about things because they make us uncomfortable. I think that's a pathway to ignorance, and it just perpetuates the problems that we've seen. We can't hide from the things that are uncomfortable. Listen, women didn't have the right to vote for a very long time in this country. But if we ban people from educating people about that history, we'll misunderstand some of the disparities that we still see around gender. Black people were disenfranchised, they were brutalized, they were excluded, they were lynched, they were segregated. And if we ban people from learning about that, we won't understand the legacy of that. I think education isn't really education if we take out anything that makes us uncomfortable, if we take out anything that makes us ashamed. The most effective education actually explores those things so that we get to a better place. We used to make children work in mines. We used to do horrific things to people. And we'll do them again if we don't understand that history. So I think it's a mistake to try to ban or to limit education. We need to create a generation of people that are committed to never again tolerating the sort of racial bigotry that allowed slavery to exist for 250 years, that allowed lynching to exist for a century, that allowed states to codify racial hierarchy and segregation, that allows people to believe that targeting people of color and subjecting them to abuse and violence because of their race is acceptable. And the only way we get to that future is by learning this history and committing to not allowing this history to repeat itself. If you don't know the history, you won't know that you're repeating something barbaric and horrific. So I absolutely believe that we cannot embrace any politics, the politics of silence, which I hear some politicians now preaching.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
One of the things that I think makes America great is that we are free to be passionate in our political debate. When, however, that debate becomes a rewriting of our history, we as a nation are worse for it. As a student who not long ago learned about the brutal realities of slavery in my classroom, I speak for myself when I say it was not divisive and it did make me feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to. Slavery is a stain on our nation's history, but until we confront it all, especially the uncomfortable parts, we will not breach the divide Ron DeSantis and others believe can be ignored if it is just erased from our textbooks. But the history of slavery is, of course, even in the most transparent classrooms, incomplete at best. New York was not a bystander to slavery, far from it. My home state engineered it, built its city on the backs of its oppressed, and profited from it. When given a chance to lead in ending its practice, its leaders instead chose to extend it. It may be hard to find, but if you look hard enough, especially with the help of the good people who contributed to the special, you can still see the legacies of those who paid the ultimate price and their oppressors in the city that is synonymous with freedom. It's a chapter of history that deserves to be told. Thank you so much for tuning in.